starting off the show, though, going to be talking about the Minnesota Timberwolves, who were able to avoid the sweep last night with their backs against the wall. They end up winning this game 105-100. Now, before we sort of get into the bigger picture here for the Timberwolves in terms of whether or not they can come back, I think that it is definitely worth just talking about the fact that, we couldn't really expect this version of Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns, this sort of subdued version where they were very inefficient through the majority of this series, and they finally bounced back in this game. Anthony Edwards in particular was really the driving force for them. He was their leading scorer, 29 points, came just short of a triple-double as well. And we are seeing the improved playmaking with him throughout. I think that this postseason, Anthony Edwards has never been a bad playmaker necessarily, but I do think that, this being his first deep postseason run, he is now sort of experiencing what it's like to be a star and getting that treatment through the duration of a playoff series. And we are seeing his ability to sort of navigate double teams and such take on a more and more significant role. He came out firing 14 points in the first quarter, I believe, and, has just... It was interesting with him because he did get himself into foul trouble. That was a huge conversation really for Minnesota as a whole. There was an interesting stretch there down the final few minutes of the first half where Anthony Edwards, Karl-Anthony Towns, and Rudy Gobert all had 3 fouls, so they were having to close out with the bench unit and actually did a pretty good job in those minutes. But Edwards, part of the reason he was in foul trouble is because he was taking on the Luka Doncic assignment sort of at an enhanced rate. And we've talked about this before. There really isn't a player in the NBA that can fully shut down Luka Doncic, so there's only so much you can do. I thought Edwards' energy and his defense was good for a span there, but at the same time, you saw, especially in the second and third quarters, he was a little bit more run down, added to the fact that he was dealing with this foul trouble, and a couple of them, when he's fouling Luka at half court, listen, I understand Anthony Edwards is wired to be an extremely high motor player, and that's what he brings, and that's what we all appreciate about him, but the Timberwolves rely on him too much to have him sort of sitting on the bench, and ultimately it came back around for him late in the third quarter, early in the fourth quarter, and like I mentioned, that playmaking as well, he was the one sort of setting up Karl-Anthony Towns for those 2 massive threes that he hit in the fourth quarter, forced a 6-point swing, and really from that, the Timberwolves just sort of kept that 5-point lead throughout the rest of the game. Karl-Anthony Towns, it was such a typical I wouldn't say typical necessarily, but we got the full Karl-Anthony Towns experience last night where I did think that he was really successful offensively when he wasn't doing stupid stuff, which is always sort of the caveat with Towns. Just some of the fouls with him are so infuriating because he puts himself in these compromising positions, and every time he freaks out as if it's the most outlandish thing that he gets called for those fouls. But, just about every single one of them was the right call. Now, I obviously have talked about it before. I don't love that call where for the foul that he picked up right at the end of the game with a minute and a half left that took him out for the rest of the game. He sort of lunged out at Luka Doncic. Now, Luka was definitely trying to initiate contact in this as well. So you let me know how you feel about that call in the comment section. But again, we just saw it all the way throughout the game where he was just picking up these dumb fouls. And again, the way that he looks appalled when he's called for it, it just, it drives me a little bit crazy. But it was really encouraging to see him have this bounce back game where I thought he did a great job attacking the rim, actually looked, coordinated and put together, and I don't know if the absence of Derek Lively gave him some sort of extra confidence. Now, that being said, Maxi Kleber returned for the Mavericks in this game, and he did draw a couple charges against Towns, so I'm not sure exactly what it was. Obviously, Lively a little lengthier than Kleber, so maybe that was part of it, but then it was the three-point shooting, where Towns was 0 for 8 the other night, and in this game, specifically in the second half, he got himself going, didn't even attempt a three in the first half, but finished this game 4 of 5, and you see the fouls and the minutes on the screen. Again, it is frustrating with him that he puts himself in these positions that he is unable to play some of these crunch time minutes, but the Timberwolves obviously at least have a good enough backup option in Naz Reid that it's not entirely detrimental to them, and obviously they win last night, so it wasn't ultimately the biggest deal in the world. But Towns, I just thought it was such a prototypical what you sort of get in terms of the roller coaster from him. And on the Mavericks side of this series, or of this game, I don't think that there was really all too much that you can say in terms of, instead of, you can't manufacture importance and what's the word I'm looking for? More so motivation. And I think that for the Mavericks being up 3-0, it was just a lot easier for the Timberwolves to sort of get up for this game. And Anthony Edwards, like I mentioned, he came out flying early. And ultimately, you just got some off nights from Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, where they both shot 33% from the field and struggled from the three-point line. Now, Draymond Green on the TNT show was talking about how he thought that there was something for the Timberwolves to build off of in terms of the Kyle Anderson minutes and having him be the primary for Luka. I don't necessarily know about that. I mean, I thought that Luka pretty much all the second half was doing a really good job of sort of beating Kyle Anderson on that initial dribble, getting Anderson behind him on his hip and sort of just surveying the field from there. Ultimately, some shots that you wish went down for the Mavericks. This would not be a panic mode situation to me whatsoever. Now, it's interesting as this series moves on here, where it is going back to Minnesota for Game 5, and you would think that the Timberwolves aren't going to lose all 3 of their games at home, considering how amped up that fan base has been during this postseason run. But at the same time, I do think that the Mavericks are an extremely tough mismatch for the Timberwolves. It sounds like Derek Lively is headed towards being available to come back moving forward here. I do think that he is a very important piece of this. Daniel Gafford had a nice game for himself. He was all over the place to begin that third quarter in terms of just being that lob threat. But it's clear that Kleber still isn't 100% healthy, and he's somebody that if the Mavericks are to advance to the finals, I think could get some more significant minutes and more impactful when he's actually on the court. But it was definitely clear there was a hesitancy with him trying to shoot. That's one of his main assets, is the fact that he is the big option for them that can space out the floor more, and he didn't seem comfortable with the idea of, he had some open looks that he passed up on. Now, he ends up taking a couple shots in this game, but ultimately, he goes 0 for 2 on the three-point looks, and again, I just don't think that was his priority coming into this game, and obviously dealing with a dislocated shoulder for a good reason. There was also one point as well in the third quarter, I think it was, where there was a loose ball sort of around the half court, and you could just see him sort of really scared to dive down for that loose ball. And that being said, he took the couple charges against Towns, so overall, he was active setting screens for the Dallas ball handlers. I think that he'll be fine in the long run, but I do think that the Derek Lively piece of this is very important, specifically for this matchup in particular against the Timberwolves. But again, Game 5 going back to Minnesota, I do think the Wolves have a good chance of making this series a little bit more competitive. I definitely wouldn't be putting all my stock into the Timberwolves being the first team to come back down 0-3, but there is sort of an irrational confidence with Anthony Edwards that he is probably one of the, more qualified leaders to potentially lead this type of a run just off of a little bit of arrogance as well. And I say that in a good way because he's just sort of, too young to, really be looking at the full history of everything. And I do think that there's a level of desperation from Rudy Gobert, obviously has been sort of dragged through the mud through these past couple rounds to some degree. And Mike Conley, their, other leader, maybe a little bit more quiet in terms of the, what we hear from a national media perspective. But within that locker room, Mike Conley is the one, and he's been very vocal with the team in terms of you never know when you're going to get these types of opportunities moving forward. So, going to be interesting to see. I definitely wouldn't consider Game 5 a must-win for the Mavericks, but the longer this series goes on, obviously the more pressure that comes on to the Mavericks, and they're a team that, dealing with whatever extent of the Lively injury, trying to work Maxi Kleber back in more, and we've seen Luka Doncic dealing with all these injuries throughout the course of the year that I sort of feel like the Mavericks want to wrap this series up as soon as possible, and that's sort of common sense, but just sort of also taking into consideration some of the injury factors with this Mavericks team, while you see the Celtics on the other end of the bracket where they are sort of resting up right now, trying to get Kristaps Porzingis back and fully healthy. The Mavericks want to make sure that that rest period can be as even as possible. As we have a comment from Lil Fettuccini, can the Timberwolves rally back to tie it 3-3? I mean, if you're the Timberwolves right now, you got to be taking it one game at a time. And obviously starts with Game 5. That game is going to be tomorrow night, Thursday night. Having that series at home, if you are going to build up some type of a significant momentum to get this thing going, then it starts there. Again, I do kind of feel like, I don't know if the Timberwolves did anything different necessarily to throw off Luka and Kyrie. I kind of just felt like it was off nights for them. And again, you can't manufacture desperation. The Timberwolves were definitely playing like it. Sometimes I do think sort of to their own undoing, getting a little bit too excited and putting themselves in foul trouble. But the Timberwolves, Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns, like I mentioned, they were really struggling during the first few games of this series. Edwards, better off than Towns was through the first few games, and I thought that specifically that third quarter of Game 3 for Edwards seemed like he was going to lead the comeback win there, and it stinks for them that they let that one sort of slip away. Also, looking back at Game 2 as well, getting that Naz Reid situation, but they've played the Mavericks close in every one of these losses as well, so last night it was the Timberwolves building up enough of a cushion that they can sort of make these mistakes at times. The Anthony Edwards foul, by the way, against Luka with just 30 or so seconds left, where Luka ends up missing the free throw to make it potentially a 2-point game. But again, those sort of youth mistakes that the Timberwolves are not necessarily fully past at this point, as much as the youth is a positive for them. A lot of the times we see them make some of these errors at times, and last night it didn't cost them, and that's why the ball don't lie, as Lil Fettuccini says. I think that Edwards one was, I can't necessarily defend that. Again, if you want to go a couple possessions earlier where Towns fouled Luka, again, I don't think that it was this massive miscarriage of justice that Towns did pick up that foul. I just don't enjoy that type of a move from Luka where he fully knew what he was doing, trying to draw the foul from Towns, sort of initiating that contact. Towns stepped up and got a little bit in the landing area, but at the same time, you can make the argument his hands were straight up, he was leaning back, and ultimately the Timberwolves they are too good of a team to get swept. So to your point, ball don't lie. I think that, the series ultimately kind of should be in this position. Again, the Timberwolves absolutely could have won some of these earlier games, but the late game execution of the Mavericks has been considerably better up to this point. So I think that ultimately the landing spot here of the Mavericks being up 3-1 feels right. And, I think that the Mavericks, or the Timberwolves again, can make this interesting and extend this series a little bit longer than a lot of people gave them credit for. But, this does feel like the Mavericks, in one of these situations, given how much better their crunch time offense has been to the Timberwolves, that they are going to be able to win one of these next 3 games that it is. So let me know how you feel about this series moving forward in the comments section. We're going to be taking our first break though, and we're actually going to be calling a little bit of an audible on the fly here. I think that I want to dive into the Bronny James draft decision up next, and then we're going to get into the NHL series as well, but sort of stick basketball while we are on the topic. So we're going to be diving into that whole Bronny James conversation, but first, a quick break, and we will be right back. Stick with us.